محمد وآل محمد صلوات. Brothers and sisters, the next part of our program is the recitation of the Holy Quran by Bilal Versi. Please welcome him with our salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والذين استجابوا لربهم وقاموا الصلاة وأمرهم شورى بينهم وبما رزقناهم ينفقون والذين إذا أصابهم البغي هم ينتصرون وجزاء سيئة مثلها فمن عفا وأصلح فأجره على الله إنه لا يحب الظالمين ولمن انتصر بعد ظلمه فأولئك ما عليهم من سبيل إنما سبيل على الذين يظلمون الناس ويبغون في الأرض بغير الحق أولئك لهم عذاب عليم ولمن صبر وغفر إن ذلك لمن عزم الأمور صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Today we're very fortunate to have Em Hilton, who'll be speaking to us on the topic of organizing for collective liberation. Let's welcome her with a round of applause. Em Hilton is a Jewish writer and activist based in London. She's the International Policy Director at Diaspora Alliance and a co-founder of NAMOD, British Jews Against Occupation. And she also sits on the steering committee for the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. And we're very fortunate to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
Let's just start by talking about yourself and what you've been doing, what you currently do, and your co-founding of NAMOD and how that all happened.
Yeah, so first of all, good Shabbos, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really, thank you. It's really a privilege to be here, spending Friday night with you all. So yeah, my name is Em, or Emily. I am a Jewish organizer and writer. I live in London, in Hackney, but I grew up in Australia, in Sydney. I grew up in a pretty traditional Jewish family, which gave me a really strong sense of what it meant to be a Jewish person in the world today, what it meant to stand up for justice, but also, as is very common with Jewish communities and Jewish families around the world, also a strong connection to Israel. And I guess that's sort of where my story starts, is what it meant to grow up in a community where the values that they taught me to uphold and support around human rights and equality and social justice were sort of left at the door when it came to Israel. And when I was 18, I went to live in Israel for a year. And what I often say is that, and what happened is that I lived in Israel for a year and I didn't meet a single Palestinian until I went to university in London a year later. And it was through this process of not only meeting Palestinians, but also experiencing what I described at dinner is like a challenge to some of the views that I'd had growing up, that I'd experienced in my Zionist youth movement, that I'd experienced in my family through meeting other people and eventually spending more time in the West Bank, meeting Palestinian communities and seeing the reality of Israeli apartheid and occupation, that really allowed me to shift into this process of unlearning and moving away from Zionism and into a belief in the importance of collective liberation and justice for all. There are a few different ways that happened. The first is that I got involved with an organization called the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which brings Jews from around the world to take part in nonviolent co-resistance with Palestinian communities in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I spent a lot of time in the South Hebron Hills, in Masafayetta, in places like Tuani and Omocher. If anyone's seen the film No Other Land, many of those people are my friends. They're people I've known for a long time. And that really showed me the importance also of what does it mean, as Rabbi Heschel said, to pray without feet? What does it mean to really live out this commitment to shared liberation and social justice on the ground? And what does it mean to be a Jewish person in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians? And then from there, I came back to the UK and I helped found an organization called Na'amod. Na'amod means we will stand in Hebrew. And it's Na'amod Jews against UK Jews against Israeli occupation and apartheid. I was about to say Israeli Jews against UK apartheid, but slightly different thing. And we got set up because in 2018, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, during the Great March of Return, Israeli soldiers shot and killed one day 52 Palestinian people who were marching for their freedom towards the separation wall at the border of Gaza. And this really felt, a lot of us have obviously watched many different iterations of serious violence that Israel has wrought on Palestinians. Obviously, the 2014 attack on Gaza then was a very, for my generation, quite a profound moment. But I think this really felt particularly horrific, I think, in that sense of the senselessness of that act and the shooting fish in a barrel is what it felt like, I think, to watch and witness. And so we said, we came together in Parliament Square, about 60 Jewish folks, and we came together and we said Kaddish, we said the mourner's prayer for everyone who had been killed. And to be quite honest, we'd spent a couple of years at that point trying to build out a bigger movement of Jews, anti-apartheid Jewish work in the UK, and it hadn't been too effective. And the good thing about this time is that someone from a very right-wing pro-Israel advocacy YouTube site came and filmed us and put it on YouTube, and it caused this huge scandal in the Jewish community in the UK, which meant that we were essentially able to set up a crowdfunder and raise a bunch of money and sort of set up our movement. So thank you to that man who tried to slight us and ended up helping kickstart our movement, which he did in fact once admit to us when we ran into him on the street. And from there, we've been really thinking a lot about what does it mean to be Jewish people in the struggle for solidarity with Palestinians and for liberation of Palestine, and what does it also mean to do this work both in our communities, accepting where our communities are at, the challenge of that, the pain of that, the frustration of that, but also the responsibility we have in a broader public conversation around how Jewish people are often used as justification to continue an anti-Palestinian political agenda, to promote ongoing relations and support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. And what does it mean to sort of build out a growing movement of anti-Zionist Jews like myself, and also non-Zionist Jews and people who really are part of this collective liberation piece. And I guess that's so that's the work that we've been doing, and we'll talk a bit more about the post-October 7th reality, but that's the volunteering that I do in my day job. As I'm sure many people here, again, are aware of and have had to probably deal with at some point. I think a lot of us are very aware of the ways in which, as I said, sort of Jewish people or anti-Semitism can be often misused or politicized as a way to justify cracking down on dissent around protesting for Palestinian freedom, on human rights, on even just supporting Palestine. as well as sort of the often, like now we also see the sort of justification of combating anti-Semitism is used to support very undemocratic political agendas, more generally as well, not just in relation to Palestine. So in my day job, I work for an organization that is really trying to build a new way of thinking about both how we address anti-Semitism and challenge anti-Semitism alongside challenging this politicization. And so I work for this organization called Diaspora Alliance. We're an international organization, and we do work on both of those issues around, we do policy, we do advocacy, we do trainings, we do political advising, those kinds of things. And we do that work to really sort of embody what does it mean to think about a new way forward for collective safety, for collective communal solidarity. And yeah, so that's kind of what I do. This issue has sort of become my entire sort of personal and political life and professional life. And I feel very honored to be able to do that work. And I also know, as many of you in this room know, the challenges of when that sort of personal and political are so intertwined. But it really is, it's, for these kinds of situations, these kinds of events, that I really appreciate that opportunity and the work that I do.
Thank you so much. And can you talk a little bit about, you talked about the non-violent resistance that
Yes.
that in Israel, you talked about previously when we were having dinner, you talked about founding a group there. Can you just talk about some of the work you've been doing in the area?
So it's also not necessarily founding, but I think there's been a few different iterations of groups. There's been lots of groups who sort of do solidarity work in the West Bank. We have International Solidarity Movement, ISM, Project Dove, but that's mostly made up of non-Jewish people. And then there were some Israeli groups, particularly after the Second Intifada. There was a group called Taish, for example, of very radical Israelis who would go and support Palestinian farmers in the West Bank who are under attack by soldiers or settlers. And then in the 2010s, that's right, 2015, 2016, a woman called Elana Somka set up an organization called the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which was basically about, as I said, bringing Jews from around the world to take part in these nonviolent co-resistance in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And I guess that was sort of, I think, the beginning of a new era of Jewish people really spending sustained time in different communities, away from kind of like the sort of coexistence, tell us your life story, we'll tell you ours, we'll sit around, but actually like what are the projects we can be doing to support these communities to be able to exist and remain on their land, and to resist the violence of settlers and soldiers, which are at a near daily basis. And so I was on one of the very first delegations of Jewish folks who went and did that, and then I led those delegations subsequently. And
what does delegation mean? What does that
Sorry, yeah, of course, I apologize. So a delegation is when you spend 2 weeks there, embedded in these communities, taking part in work that is led by those communities, or you could Palestinian communities, yeah. And also in terms of they might be direct actions that are done, because the idea behind it is that at the time, having international presence in those spaces would be an added layer of protection, which could also, as a result, lead to a sort of stronger piece of resistance. So it's sort of this idea of, I don't like necessarily talking in this phrase, but putting bodies on the line, like really sort of putting yourselves in between soldiers or settlers and Palestinians, but very much in a way that is collaborative and led by those Palestinian activists themselves and those communities. And that sort of transitioned into when it sort of felt like that was good for a time, but actually wasn't so effective, really working directly with those communities to think about what would be effective. And that was about a more sustained long-term presence of people regularly in Mesafiyate, in the South Hebron Hills, documenting on a daily basis the violence and the attacks and the attempts to erase those communities and ethnically cleanse those communities from their land. And that sort of meant staying overnight or staying for weeks at a time. And so I was both part of that in terms of sort of thinking strategically about how CJNV would bring more sustained presence, but also have taken part in numerous kinds of those solidarity shifts myself as well.
And given what's happened, on October 7th and following, how has that impacted the work that you've been doing, and impacted yourself, your friends, community, and also the work and the volunteer work you're doing at Namod?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, well, just to start with with CJV and sort of the broader solidarity presence work there, it's as we can all, I think what's been so troubling or sort of whiplash-esque of the last 2 years is it has been so horrific and calamitous on a scale that feels almost incomprehensible in terms of the violence. But you've also seen, I think, this real uptick and surge in not only support for Palestine and support for Palestinian freedom, but people really wanting to be involved in that kind of solidarity. So on the ground, things look pretty dire. We are seeing, daily attacks. I think even before October 7th, 2023, had seen the highest number of Palestinian children killed since I think the Second Intifada, and that the ramping up of that in this sense of that the impunity with which Israel was acting in Gaza was also happening in the West Bank against these communities, but you also saw this upsurge in presence of activists and people willing and wanting to be there and be in support and solidarity and bearing witness to this. So both of those elements are true, which is it can be such a confusing thing to be seeing. Both the sort of perhaps we are seeing potentially in the process of seeing a free Palestine, but the horror that's going to come before that is really difficult to bear. I think in terms of Na'amad and in terms of what we saw happening, I guess on the macro level and then also in the communal level, is that. It was incredibly horrific. I think everyone can attest to what it means to watch a genocide live stream from our phones every day, to feel like every day you're seeing the worst thing you have ever seen, and the inaction of our government, the inaction of most of the Western world in the face of that. In terms of Na'amad and in terms of that Jewish organizing, I think what we saw in our communities, again, was this fracture. You had the sort of representational bodies or institutions who carte blanche supported and defended what Israel was doing, even when faced often with the most horrific evidence of genocide, of starvation, of cruelty. But at the same time, we saw a huge surge in membership and desire to get involved with Na'amad, to be taking a really clear moral and political stance that this is not in our name, that this genocide is unacceptable, that we will not allow this to, we will not allow ourselves to be used as justification for the British government's inaction. And really our membership tripled in size. I said this also at dinner, Na'amad was the first Jewish group in the UK, as far as I'm aware, to hold a vigil mourning the deaths of both Palestinians and Israelis on October 10th. And we really, at that point, thought there was going to be like 10 of us who turned up to this vigil. Like, we didn't even bring enough printouts for what we were going to read. And then hundreds of people came. And I think that to us, that really made us feel like actually this is a moment, and that there's so many more of us, and there will be attempts, obviously, by our community to make us seem marginal. But actually, we represent not only much higher proportions of Jews in this country than they want us to believe, but also that we are the future. This is where we are going. We believe that we can build out new communities based in justice and freedom and equality and dignity for everyone, and that we don't need to compromise, that Jewish freedom will not come at the expense of Palestinians. And I think that really gave me a lot of grounding and hope in the last couple of years. I think that's sort of where it has been. I think obviously we'll talk a bit more about the wider context, but I think particularly, it's the most difficult. Well, one of the most difficult things for me this year, I think, last year was one of these activists that I got to know very well, called Auda Hathleen from Khair. Khair is a village in the South Hebron Hills. Just outside Masafiyata technically, but also part of Masafiyata, and it sits on a settlement sits on its border, and this is a very radical settlement, and there's a lot of violence and destruction now daily. And in the summer last year, Auda was shot and killed by a settler in front of his 2-year-old son while he was trying to defend a water pipe that the settler was trying to cut near their home. And his name was Yinon Levy. He was actually on these sanction lists, because we all know that sanctions are the way to go of individuals. And he was murdered. And I think that was such a clear a break. I think it was a shattering moment for so many of us who'd been touched by Alda's activism and welcoming, and I think this sense that, we can make a difference with this presence. I think the tragedy of this time is really, it's very difficult to know what will make a difference. And this sense of what does it mean to maybe know that, or not be sure whether actually what we're doing is going to work, but what does it mean to still show up in solidarity with these communities? On my 34th birthday, which happened in August, I sat with Alda's wife, where she told us the story of what that day was like for her. And for me, that was such an important thing to do, but also it really shows I think the intertwinedness of so many of us who've been involved in this work for so long, the fear that we're going to lose a lot of the people that we love, and we won't be able to stop that. So, and I'm sure many people in this room know people who have been killed in Gaza. That level of death, it feels like, it was incomprehensible for me to think about, Alda being killed, and imagine having to do that hundreds of thousands of times over. Is just the weight of the grief I think we're all still living through.
Thank you. You talked quite clearly about the genocide that's there. Language in these on this topic sometimes becomes very political, very charged, very challenging. How do you navigate the usage of language as Namad and more broadly as yourself when it comes to this topic? Like genocide, is that a word? I mean, you talk about it easily.
Mm-hmm.
Many Jews who I know would find language like that very difficult to use, or even if they happen to be anti-occupation, be amongst the liberal Zionist group, they'd find, or some of them would find usage of terms like genocide very, very difficult. In particular, the idea that how can it be our community as Jews who have faced genocide, have faced the Holocaust, actually committing a genocide? Different terminology, but still in that language. Do you see any problems with usage of language from a Namad perspective?
Well, I don't want to talk as on behalf of Namad does. Well, I think first of all, I'd say the reason it's important to call it a genocide is because it is a genocide. We have to call things what they are in order to defeat them, and that is a moral obligation people have in the world as people who care about shared humanity and universal values, and that if you don't name it, you can't address it. And we see, and in the same way that I see that, in the way that I would never want someone to challenge the validity of calling the Holocaust a genocide, I think that it's for me, I don't see any difference in, or hierarchy of pain or difficulty. And I think that, one of the reasons, my grandparents, one side of my grandparents survived the Holocaust. And the reason I do the work that I do is because this concept of never again for anyone is the rallying cry of my generation of Jewish people. And I think it's very important that particularly in a time where, there's two things happening, I think, in that question, is that there's a internal sort of sense of what does it mean for Jewish people to reckon with genocide done in our name? I wouldn't say that. I think it's important to say in that context, I would say the Israeli state as a state of which is enacting that genocide. I think, and that's what I think a lot of us have to reckon with in that process of unlearning Zionism, is that Israel is not this sort of Disneyland where we are all welcome, or it's made for us. It's a country, it's a nation that has a political interest and does these things that are horrific in its own interest. That doesn't mean we aren't appalled by the ways in which it does that in justifying those things in the name of Jews, but they are slightly different things. But I think the other thing that we have to be really clear on is the way in which there has been a targeted effort by the British state, by Israel advocates, to shield or obscure the reality of Israel's crimes and atrocities in Gaza by making language off limits. And I think in particular, that's why it's important for me as a Jewish person, but not only as a Jewish person, to say genocide, because that is what it is, and we have to be able to challenge that. And sometimes I like to think that, or I like to hope that me saying that gives other people the space to say that too, if it is used as if anyone is trying to suggest that calling what Israel's doing a genocide is like an offensive thing to Jewish people.
Look, let me push on one of the things
Sure.
that you talked about in terms of, Israel claims itself to be the Jewish state.
Yeah.
When it comes to the UK, I think you touched on this earlier, the collective Jewish bodies, which are seen to be representatives of Jews in the UK, or at least some Jews in the UK, or most, or whatever that right, some, okay, in the UK, and are seen as the political representatives. They've been, and the chief rabbi, who is, if you like, the religious, or perceived to be the religious representation of some Jews in the UK. From an outside-in perspective, when you see the communal Jewish organizations being quite clear that what Israel's doing is something that they're strongly supportive of, and any attack on Israel is almost or critique of Israel, especially a strong critique, ends up being potentially anti-Semitic, and the terms are sort of mixed up. How do you navigate sometimes this potential contradiction that on the one hand it's the Jewish state, but on the other hand it's not all Jews, and you shouldn't mix the two up? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and probably something that we will continue to grapple with. I think sometimes it's about having to recognize there are sort of multiple truths in this situation. So it is true that Israel is a nation state that intentionally that commits atrocities and does so while deploying Jewish imagery or ritual, that does so wearing a Star of David, that does so claiming that it's doing so in the name of all Jewish people. But it is also true that as a nation state, it wants to protect its political interests, like all nation states do, particularly those that commit horrific violence, of which there are many, and that those states will do so by picking up any tools in their arsenal they can to do so. Israel's actions in Gaza are atrocious. And of course, there is this element of supremacy, but I think that is much more part of supremacist societies exist when there is apartheid or inequality, and it's not inherent to Judaism or its Jewish character. And I think that's where you can make these distinctions. And it is important for us to be able to do that. That doesn't mean that this is also why something I often say is that, I think a lot of people in the community, because they see it as an additional layer of safety. So they feel like, either things aren't safe where they are and they want to have a backup plan, which again is like also complicated because there are people who live in Israel, Palestine, or Palestine, Israel, who don't have their own backup plan. It's an interesting concept on a different level, but maybe that's for another time. And I think what I have been really clear on, and a lot of us in our motto talk about, and others, is that, nothing Israel does has made Jewish people more safe. If anything, committing a genocide and justifying it in the name of Jewish people actually makes us very much less safe, because it suggests that we are somehow ambassadors or mascots for this genocidal destruction. And, I think that is a really important thing to say. I think there is, in terms of people like the chief rabbi, in terms of these institutions, maybe like the Board of Deputies, for example, they first of all, they're definitely, this idea that you can have a representative body of Jews is kind of ridiculous. I think that these often, particularly institutions like the chief rabbi, actually specifically, and the Board of Deputies, is that they were set up by the British state, so they would only in the 1800s. So they would just have to deal with that Jewish person or that Jewish group. So that, it was like this representational politics, So this idea that they are somehow like a Jewish parliament is ridiculous. But also that, I think that's a dereliction of duty. I think actually what we have seen with these institutions is that they would rather defend Israel, whether, that's defending or justifying what's happening in Gaza or supporting it. They would rather do that, and they prioritize that over what would actually keep the communities that they're supposed to represent allegedly safer, which is, supporting human rights, recognizing that, genocide is bad, recognizing that we need to be working with other communities who are also facing concerns or threats in this country. What does it look like for Jewish people in this country to thrive? And I think that their decision to support Israel over that actually puts a lot of us in danger. I think it's a very dangerous thing that they're doing. And then I think in terms of how to navigate that, that is also why organizations or movements like Narmod exist, because we are trying to show, even if we can't necessarily claim that we are representative, what we're trying to show is this idea that there is anyone representative isn't true. We're muddying the waters. We're showing there's lots of different Jewish people in this country, and that's why instead of taking a sort of representational approach, we should take, or governments or whoever should take an approach where it's like a rights-based approach. How are we keeping the most amount of people safe? How are we making sure that minorities are protected in general, not just Jewish people? Does that make sense?
That does. And I guess the challenge with that is some of these communal groups have almost weaponized the idea of racism or anti-Semitism when it comes to Jewish communities, and weaponized it in a way that has then made other people very unsafe. If they're Palestinians or pro-Palestinians on the street, they're called terrorists, they're called pro-Hamas, they're called Islamists, they're called a mixture of different things. Whether or not they're Muslim, it doesn't really matter. And you have the Maccabi Tel Aviv situation that happened. Like, it seems like there's the ability of certain groups, or the choice of certain groups, to really advocate on behalf of pro-Israel positions is very damaging for, I think, Jewish communities and others across the country.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's twofold things happening, right? Like, I think you see both the government and the state, who's really happy to enact a racist political agenda and an Islamophobic political agenda, and does so under the name of, or justified by, combating anti-Semitism, which is obviously ridiculous. So you don't keep Jewish people safe by being Islamophobic or oppressing Palestinian protest or oppressing protests in general, etc. And that, we have to ask ourselves, why does the government want to do that? And what is that about beyond this issue? But then you do also, of course, have these communal bodies who have actively, I say actively, sort of wrought a campaign that has promoted a racist and Islamophobic agenda, that has intentionally conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which is very dangerous. Yeah, as you say, not only for Jewish people, but for others, has intentionally fed this divide and rule political game that I think the British government has consistently played. And it's appalling. I think it's appalling, and it's shameful. And it's why, again, I think that a lot of Jewish people are speaking out in this time and sort of thing, and get so frustrated when these organizations are taken as sort of the representative voice, or because it's not only morally bankrupt, it's also actively putting people at risk. I think the Maccabi Tel Aviv thing is completely absurd, but I do think there's a bigger question to be asked of, what politics does it serve to create such a meal out of what is essentially like a policing safety issue? Like, I don't know if people know this, but the week after they were banned from Birmingham, the Tel Aviv Municipal Authority also banned them from going to the football match because they were going to be too violent. And it's like, well, it's completely absurd. And I think this, when we are saying everything is anti-Semitism, then nothing is, right? And when we actually are living in a time where a lot of we are facing a rise in anti-Semitism, we're also facing a rise in the far right, of a political polarization that is dangerous to lots of different minority communities. We've seen obviously attacks on mosques in the last decade, and particularly in the last couple of years. We've seen the sort of Tommy Robinson marches. We've seen attacks on asylum seeker hotels, on Jewish communities, on migrants, trans people. We are living through a time of deep political instability and violence towards minority and minoritized communities. This idea that you can only protect one, or that one is suffering more than another, to me is sort of absurd. We need to be having a holistic approach that protects all of us. That's certainly what drives my politics and my organizing.
And on all of this, as you said, there is real anti-Semitism that's happening, on the streets, that's there. But the definition seems to be quite political. Or the definition of anti-Semitism has become quite political. The IHRA definition, and the work that you're doing at Diaspora Alliance has been challenging some of that. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in that space?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to say about the IHRA definition, well, first thing I would say is there's never, this whole conversation around definitions is a very contemporary one. It's one that sort of really came out of the the noughts and the 2010s. There's never been sort of like Jews can't agree on anything, let alone a definition of anti-Semitism. And that's why we sort of also know it's a political tool, this idea to say that there is only one definition, and we can see obviously a huge amount of problems with that definition, particularly the examples, which do conflate a lot of criticism for Israel with anti-Semitism. And also, I think, so it's problematic for that reason, but it's also problematic because it's actually not a great way to fight anti-Semitism either. I think in a time, particularly right now, when I think a lot of governments, and I'm sure many people in this room have either had experience with this directly or with the work, or perhaps even in political engagement, is that, I think a lot of politicians want really quick fixes to issues, particularly when it comes from minoritized communities. And so, saying, we'll just adopt this definition is a great way to look like you're doing something to fight anti-Semitism when actually you're not really doing anything. And so the approach that we have at Diaspora Alliance and in the work, and also I guess NAMOD too, is like, what are the actual tangible things that governments and communities and leaders should be doing to help eradicate anti-Jewish prejudice from our societies? And the thing that we say very clearly is the way you do that is fighting it alongside other racisms, fighting alongside Islamophobia, other forms of oppression, because these things are all connected. We know that it's not a coincidence that when a synagogue is attacked, a mosque is attacked 2 days later. It's not a coincidence that you see the ways in which, one group is, that the far right want to target Jewish people, and they also want to target Muslims, even though they're now pretending they love Jewish people, right? So this is, these things are all connected. So it doesn't only make practical sense to do this, it makes moral sense as well. And DA does that work in different ways. Some of it, we did have we've taken the government to court to fight the sort of centrality of the IHRA and sort of some of their education training. We do advocacy and campaigning on this issue. We've done so in the US as well, and in Europe. And we're really hoping, we'd like to do that alongside other communities to sort of think what is shared safety and collective safety as well.
Thank you. And earlier you touched on the fact, and you actually described yourself as an anti-Zionist Jew. That you made that very clear. You weren't hiding that. But does that have consequences in your own personal relationships in your communities, using terms like anti-Zionist, or is that something which is now very accepted as one thread within the Jewish community?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that any consequence that I experience for declaring myself as an anti-Zionist Jew pales in comparison to directly the experiences of Palestinians on the ground in Gaza or in the West Bank or anywhere in 48. And that's why it's so important for me to do that. It's also, me being able to say these things, I do have an added layer of privilege or protection compared obviously often to people of color, in particular Muslim communities and Muslim people as well, who declare themselves those things, which is why anti-Zionist, which is why I think it's important that I do that. And it's also, obviously what I believe. I don't think, even both from the fact that the moral cost is too high, I don't think Zionism is a good organizing principle for Jewish safety or liberation. I think we should be able to be safe and thrive wherever we are. But I think in terms of the cost, of course it has personal costs. For example, it's a very small thing. I got married a couple of years ago, and there was a boycott of our wedding by my partner's friends because they didn't want to go to the wedding of someone that held my politics, which was obviously very more difficult for him, obviously, but it was difficult. And I think there is a cost in terms of I've lost some friends, and I think like the sort of perhaps the spaces I used to be able to be in, I can't be in anymore, and sometimes that's okay. It's less okay when I want to organize those spaces. I feel like I want to, I think something that's really important to me is building out Jewish spaces where I feel like I don't have to check my values at the door, which is why also NAMOD exists, and we have such a strong community space, because it's important for us to show, if you want Jewish people to jump, if you want someone to jump, you need to give them something to jump to. You can't just say, you need to be against this. You need to say, what are you for as well? And so for us, that's why it's very important in NAMOD to have that community space, because we're trying to build out a new vision of what Judaism, that is distinct from Zionism can be. And I think that's a much harder thing to imagine in the 21st century, even though historically for Jewish people there's always been opposition to Zionism, whether that was like political reasons or just like people just didn't think it was a good idea. Like, you know, there was always a spectrum of that. So yeah, I think those personal costs have happened, but I do think that you know, there is like that is what it means to be in solidarity. Like we, you know, and if the worst thing that happens to me is a few people boycott our wedding, fine, you know, that's okay. Like, of course. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And the talk was, and you know, final questions. I want to get some views from the audience in a second, but. You know, we're talking about collective liberation. We're going to have a bit of hope on this. You know, one of the, and it's been quite negative so far, and the way I've phrased it, and sorry, that's my fault for asking those questions, but collective liberation. We've also seen some really interesting things over the last couple of years. We've seen, you know, Jews and Muslims working quite closely and those of other faiths being quite close on these marches in a way that you know, that solidarity, that working together, we've seen in larger numbers than perhaps we've seen before. What's your view of sort of collective liberation and where we are right now in trying to strategically make a difference and actually have an impact for the better?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think everyone is kind of struggling at this time for hope or something that gives us a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I think, yeah, a few things to say. I think what I have found incredibly grounding in this moment or in the last couple of years is the community that Narmod has created and the people within that of being able to hold each other in this time, and that sense of, you know, I think at the end of the day all we have is the people around us. But then, yeah, I think also this expansiveness of what does it mean to be, you know, I've met so many different interesting people who are doing such important work in different levels, whether that's, you know, the local organizers organizing, you know, the boycotts of companies complicit in Israeli apartheid, whether it's, you know, people on the marches. I also helped organize the Jewish bloc on the marches and having, you know, starting with like it being sort of the same people. And then like 6 months later, my friends were bringing their like mums and dads to the march, you know, like things are shifting. And I think that's, you know, that's what's so difficult about this time is that it feels like actually public support on the whole is actually with us. But the people in power are not, and there's a disconnect. And that can feel very demoralizing. It can feel very scary. And I think the thing that we have a responsibility to do as people who are not facing the direct onslaught that people on the ground in Palestine are, is to think about what are the new strategies we can be deploying to fit this current moment and to fit these new conditions. Because I think this is a time that is different compared to historically, where there is such a break from our ability to affect the people in power. And so what are the new ways we can be doing that? And I think that there are so many interesting and important people and groups and communities thinking about that, and that gives me a lot of hope. And I think also, you know, sometimes going back to the history books and knowing that often it's awful, but it's like, you know, sometimes things did get a lot worse before they got better, and things never really felt like they were going to change until they did. And, you know, whether that's with apartheid South Africa or the Berlin Wall or, you know, other liberation, you know, the dictatorship in Argentina, like there are models for how to think about in these points and moments. And I really do believe that, you know, we can change and life can, like things can change, and we just have to hold on to that. And yeah, I think that's all we can do.
Thank you very much. And
No
it
worries.
would be great to get some thoughts from the audience. Any questions from the audience?
I think we're going to turn the live stream off.
Oh yeah, well yeah. Let's okay. We'll end there.
Hi, my husband's watching.